Hey everyone, so this will probably be my last installment as medical lead of quality improvement. This was a study that was ongoing up until the end of March. While I was away, my physician navigators were still observing people, and I just got back a couple days ago, so I've spent the last couple days compiling these data, and I'm going to present them here, hopefully for rounds this week. So a little bit of history. So you all know that I started with the Physician Navigator project, and I did, as this graph demonstrates, demonstrate a improvement in my own efficiency, and I wanted to share this project and expand it out to other doctors. HSN didn't want to share the responsibility for that, so the project sort of died as a result. I had, though, some residual grant money left over, so the question was how to spend it. And so I thought I'd spend it for the greater good, and sort of morph this project into a time motion study. So why do we want to do a time motion study? Well, we know that doctor speed is inversely proportional to wait times, as I've demonstrated in this graph here from a previous presentation. And we know that wait times are correlated with mortality. So if we can make doctors more efficient, we can improve patient outcomes. So the purpose of a time motion study then is to quantify the average time spent by the group as a whole to make departmental improvements, and potentially also to identify individual differences to target individual improvements. So we had 9 doctors who volunteered to participate, and thank you very much for that. They were observed a total of 25 times, and our PNs made almost 14,000 observations, which is pretty remarkable. And through a sort of heuristic approach, we divided these into 10 categories. You know, it started off with me thinking, well, what do doctors spend their time doing? What are the major components of that? And then I had a talk with the PNs. We collected some data. We talked again about how the data were parsing out. We amalgamated some categories. We added some. We changed the names of others, etc. And basically, we were left with 10 categories. So here are those categories. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory. Patient means direct contact with the patient or a relative talking about the patient. Charting is writing on charts, not reviewing charts, but just writing on charts. Computer means being at a computer terminal, and for Meditech packs or whatever. Charting and computing are often done at the same time. You look at the computer, you record some results, you go back and forth. We tried to parse these out as best we could, but sometimes we said, the person was doing charting and computing at the same time. Consultation means talking with a doctor about a patient, as opposed to talking with staff, which is below, and basically that's just about everyone else, and we did talk with just about everyone else. Movement in between is walking, or as recorded in some instances, running through the department. Personal is just non-related work stuff, checking emails, surfing the web. Teaching is time with students and residents. We tried to parse this one out from patient care. So sometimes, teaching is done at the bedside. As best we could, we tried to separate them, but, there's probably some overlap there as well. Waiting, waiting on patients, waiting on rooms, etc. Equipment is just going to get or checking equipment. So those categories are here, and I'm going to present the data on average. So we spend less than half of our time in direct contact with patients. The next biggest category is charting. So we spend 18% of our time doing that. Computing is about half of that. It's the next biggest category. Talking with consultants is also pretty big. And then everything else is around 6 or less percent. So walking is 6%. I was actually surprised by that. We spend a lot of time walking through the department still. Staffing, talking to staff, 6%. Teaching, 5%. I was surprised by that one as well, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Personal time 4%, waiting and equipment both 1%. So the teaching was 5%, and then I realized, oh, that's because some of the shifts don't have learners on them. So I looked at so on average we teach about 5% of the time, but I looked at just the shifts where there were students assigned. And basically you can see here that nothing much changes apart from teaching and patient care. So basically we spend less time with the patients and more time with our residents because they're seeing patients. So not much of a surprise there. So that's the average, but what about looking at individual versus individual? Well, if you look at the percent of time spent doing each of these activities, you can see that there is some variability in terms of how much time we spend talking with patients. There are two obvious sort of outliers here. One is the yellow one, and I'm going to talk about that case, and the other is the green one. But most of them spend about, we spend about 40% of our time talking with patients. There's a little bit of variability with charting. You can see yellow is down as well, and again, I'm going to talk about that, whereas brown is a bit higher. But again, it's pretty tight in terms of variability. We're right between, I'd say 15 and 20%. That's only 5%. Computing, one outlier, but most of it's pretty tight. Consultation, a bit of room here. Maybe some genius has found a way to only talk 3% of the time with consultants, which is pretty cool. I'd like to learn his or her tricks. But most of us are around 8%. Movement, we all spend about the same amount of time walking, talking with staff, checking our iPhones, etc. Waiting, this is what I wanted to talk about, the outlier. This was just one staff who was only observed once. It was me, actually. And on that particular day, I forget what it was, but there are no patients to be seen, so I just spent some time talking with my PM. Equipment, we all spend about the same amount of time looking for equipment. So that's the percent time. But what about what does that mean in terms of number of minutes? We operate in terms of seconds and minutes. So what does that mean in terms of number of minutes spent doing each activity? So if you take that percent time and chop up a 9-hour shift, and yes, I realize I'm making an assumption there that we actually work 9 hours, which is mostly not true. Most of us work longer than that. If you chop up an average 9-hour shift, then you can see that there are differences that might be significant in the number of minutes people spend doing things. Basically, this is the same graph though as before, just to give you an idea of the number of minutes that if you're looking at your watch, maybe you could scratch out a minute or two doing some of the less desirable, less productive activities listed here. So the previous four graphs looked at how much we do each activity on average in total, but that's kind of misleading in that you'd probably conjecture, and you'd be right in conjecturing, that we actually do things more piecemeal. It's not that we spend, the first 42% of our shift seeing patients and then the rest charting and consulting and doing whatever else. It's broken up. So for the 20 to 30 patients that we see in a shift, we actually see them, 60 times. So there's a lot of repetition, especially when it comes to charting. For those 20 to 30 patients, we're charting more than 100 times. So 4 or 5 times per patient, we're charting. On the computer, similarly, for each patient, we are on the computer at least twice. Movement was the big one, with more than about almost 150 times that we moved. And keep in mind that the PNs, it takes time to record something, so you're looking at a minimum of 5 seconds for each activity that's actually measured. If an activity is less than 5 minutes, 5 seconds, it's probably not recorded. So that's one caveat. The other thing is some PNs didn't observe for the entirety of the shift, which means that the counts here are low. But even for things like equipment, we get equipment on average more than 20 times per shift. So maybe that's getting the ultrasound and then putting it back. We do things repetitively. The other thing that's interesting is that we don't spend much time doing each activity. You can see that this is for each activity measured in seconds. How much time do we spend doing it before we move on to something else? Well, patient care is the outlier. I think that's our one solace. That's our one period of time where we're not interrupted. That's a bit more than 3 minutes, and this is including the 30-second goodbye at the end. So it's probably, if you exclude that, a bit bigger than that. But most of the rest of them, we spend about 60 seconds, maybe a couple of minutes, doing things, which is surprising, even for teaching, which I would have thought involves a little bit of communication, a little bit of time. We spend on average about a little less than 2 minutes doing it. So in summary, the important points, I think, the number one important point is that less than half our time is spent talking to patients, which is what we're ostensibly paid to do. More than a third of our time is spent doing administrative tasks, so charting, computing, consultations, and getting equipment. And again, this was what the Physician Navigator program was actually meant to tackle. More than a tenth of our time is not at all useful to patients. You could argue that at least charting is kind of useful to patients, but more than a tenth of our time is not useful to patients. So moving around the department, just waiting is 1 to 2%, and personal time is 4 to 5%. So most staff were within 10% of the average for each and every activity. So this points to a focus on departmental as opposed to individual improvements. In fact, all of these things do, right? The general time and the variability. And another thing that we might want to change is the fact that we spend short periods of time on each activity and repeat often. It might be more efficient to, have that allocated time where you're just doing one thing and not interrupted. Easier said than done, I guess. I'd really like to acknowledge all of the people who participated. So Dr. Bourdon and Dr. Toner provided grants for this, which, I don't think it would have happened without it. I'd really like to thank the doctors for participating. So Pavan, Verge, Steve, Alex, Lee, Jen, Andy Primo, and Sam Uman. And the physician navigators who adapted beautifully to their new roles sort of midstream. I'd really like to thank them for that. And I'd like to thank all of you for listening. As I said, this is my last presentation. I hope this has been of some use, and I hope the group can use this information to improve. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.